Hey Internet, Katie here. Today we're doing Ask a Trans Person. So this is my first Ask a Trans Person video. I have no idea how well it's gonna do, but I had a bunch of people kind of asking me various questions on Facebook, and I thought, hey, what if I answered a bunch of things in a video and then I don't have to respond to each comment individually because I'm lazy. So I made an online form and got a bunch of questions. I'm gonna make a new form. It's gonna be down in the description so you can click it if this video makes you want to ask me more about being trans. First question, when did you know that you were trans? How did you know, and how did you feel? So this one's kind of interesting because I don't fit what a lot of people consider to be the trans narrative. The idea that people know from a young age and it sticks with them through all the years and that sort of nonsense. While a lot of people do have that experience, that's not my experience, and it's not the experience of a lot of other trans people. So personally, I didn't figure out I was trans until I was 25. So 5 years ago. Yeah. I don't really want to go into too many of the details around how I figured it out, but as soon as I had the thought, oh, I'm trans, I'm transitioning, and it was this like nebulous kind of like, oh, off there idea that didn't really feel like it came from myself. It didn't feel like it came from an internal voice so much as an external voice. I sat down really hard and went, oh, shoot. Okay. Great. The analogy that I used when I first realized that I was trans was kind of like my gender identity had been scraped together from whatever was around. You know, I had been plopped down in a construction yard, and I had all of this lumber and I built this house, but I had no blueprints. I had no idea what I was doing. All I was doing was building that which seemed to offer safety and comfort without putting me at risk. And so I spent the first 25 years of my life just kind of living in this shack that I built for myself. And this gender shack, I guess you could call it, really wasn't ever very comfortable. There were a lot of hard edges to it, and you know, you can't really get comfy when you don't build with any intention. A lot of people don't have to build gender with intention or build a gender identity with intention, but because of, you know, my formative years and the way that I had kind of pieced together this gender, it really felt uncomfortable all the time. And when I figured out that I was trans, it was like someone walked in with a set of blueprints, went, here you go, this is what you're supposed to be living in. And I looked at it and it was like my dream house, and it was so amazing. And when that happened, I looked back over the years and I could see all these little times where my gender identity had kind of peaked up, like it had almost made the surface, but it hadn't quite breached to let me know what was really going on inside my brain, basically. And it was like, kind of like thinking back, like, oh, it would have been really nice, you know, at the age of 14 to have a bed that was comfortable. Or, oh, it would have been really nice at the age of 14 to, you know what, this analogy sucks. It falls apart when I push it that far. But point is, when I was 25, it all came together like that. And all of a sudden I had this opportunity that I was allowing myself to explore gender and to, oh, what do I want to do with it, right? What is my gender? What am I, basically? And I spent 9 months figuring that out and becoming really, really, really sure. And the more I thought about it, the more I went introspective and thought about my past and thought about my future and what I wanted my future to look like, the less and less comfortable I was with the idea of not transitioning. Because the longer I went pretending to be a guy, the less real and authentic I felt. I was really, really deeply closeted towards myself prior to coming out, and as soon as I figured it out, it was like I had no other choice Plus, I was thinking about things like, oh, well, if this is part of why I'm so depressed all the time, maybe this is, one, going to help me, but two, also, if I don't do this, it's going to get worse and I'm putting myself at risk. And so the longer this goes on, the higher my chance of something happening because of gender dysphoria and depression that is completely avoidable by going through this admittedly really stressful period and transitioning. And so in the end, that's what I ended up doing. And all through that period, yeah, there were a lot of stressful times, but I just felt more and more okay with myself and more comfortable with who I am. So figuring out that I was trans was probably like the biggest weight off of my shoulders that I experienced in my whole life. And giving myself permission to transition really just cemented that. It really let me loosen up in a lot of ways, and it really let me feel things that I hadn't let myself feel prior to that. I had kept a pretty tight hold on my emotions because at a young age, through various reasons, I had really learned to lock down a lot of those emotions. So thanks for your question. The second question today is kind of a two-parter. What's the difference between being trans and cis and completely gender non-conforming? And are any trans people gender abolitionists? So being cisgender and transgender are really the dichotomy that we're talking about when we talk about most gender stuff. They simply mean across from and the same side as. That's all that trans and cis mean. And so when people start talking about like, oh, that person is cisgender, just means that when they were born, they were assigned a gender, and that happened to match the gender that ended up being right for them, that ended up being where their gender identity lies. For trans people, we are anyone, and it's a big umbrella term, but it's literally anyone whose gender does not match that which was assigned to them at birth. So that includes people of any gender identity that isn't male if they were assigned male at birth, and female if they were assigned female at birth. That's it. So anyone who's gender nonconforming or completely gender nonconforming, as the question asks, they fall under the trans spectrum. Now, there are a lot of identities under that trans spectrum, and one of those is transgender. Now, I identify as transgender. I'm a transgender woman. That means that when I was born, the doctor smacked me on the butt and said, oh, it's a boy, and it turned out, no, I'm not. I'm a woman. Well, I mean, at the time I wasn't a woman. At the time I was a baby who had a lot of fur because I was born hairy. For me, anyways, that means that I've gone through some measure of a transition, whether that be socially or medically or both, or other kinds of transitions exist. Not everyone has to have a transition, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I think there's another question that touches on that. But as far as whether gender nonconforming people are trans, if their gender identity doesn't match that which was assigned to them at birth, yeah, they're trans. So, now, the next part of the question, are there trans people who are gender abolitionists? Now, to those who don't know, gender abolitionism is the idea that as a society, we need to remove gender entirely. And by doing so, we'll get rid of some of the problems that come with living in a gender-segregated world. Now, a lot of the gender abolitionists out there think that trans people, by existing, are reinforcing a gender binary, or are reinforcing the idea that gender needs to exist because we have this gender that's strongly tied to an identity. I won't get into it too much more here, but personally, I think that society would be much better off if we had less emphasis on gender in all aspects of society. And I think in a lot of ways, abolishing gender would help that. At the same time, the abolition of gender roles and the abolition of gender as a concept are two things that might there might be a Venn diagram there that some folks see as completely overlapping, but some folks see as like, oh, hey, we can have one without the other. And I think there's a valuable discussion around that. As for whether or not some trans folks are gender abolitionists, yes, there are some trans folks who are gender abolitionists. Next question. How concerned are you about the long-term health impacts of the medications that you must be on? So I'm assuming that this person's referring strictly to hormone replacement and not to the other drugs that I personally am on for ulcerative colitis and PSC, or depression and anything else that I'm on. So staying strictly with HRT, as I said, I'm on a lot of other drugs, and they have a lot more side effects than hormonal replacement therapy. So yeah, there are some health risks that come with hormone replacement therapy, but one thing to keep in mind is that most of the studies that have been done around HRT have been actually transposed onto trans people through the lens of postmenopausal cisgender women. So when doctors generally speak of risks to transgender people, all that they're going off of is a bunch of numbers from women who are in their 50s and on kind of thing. So the health risks to younger trans people starting hormones haven't really been studied that well. One of the things to keep in mind though is that hormone replacement therapy is, for all intents and purposes, bioidentical when you're talking about estrogen. When we're talking about testosterone blockers and the like, there are some risks, kind of side effects with those. I have chronic low blood pressure because of that. That said, the long-term impacts haven't really been studied, and compared to a lot of the other drugs that I'm on, they're all pretty safe. Next question. How do you approach the topic of sex with a trans person? And the question goes on to ask, pre-op, post-op, or what if they have dysphoria around their genitals? It's funny because as a trans person, my approach to sex with a trans person might be completely different than the approach of a cisgender person. That said, I approach sex very much in the same way, regardless of that person's gender or their body or anything. That is, take it slow, lots of communication, lots of consent-based discussions, talking about what people like, what people don't like, talking about what feels good, what doesn't feel good, making sure that your partner knows that they can stop at any point, that it's very easy for them, that they don't feel pressured, right? That said, if you're potentially about to get it on with a trans person, yeah, you should be asking them like, hey, is there anything you want to talk about prior to getting our clothes off? I don't want to trigger your dysphoria in any way. I want to make sure that you're comfortable. I want to make sure that you know. I think having those sorts of discussions are the sorts of things that we as a society should be having across the board, whether cis or trans, regardless of sexual orientation. That said, with trans people, it does tend to be a little bit more of a touchy subject, right? For a personal note, I had a lot of genital dysphoria when I first started transitioning. I was really concerned about people who had penises and how I would interact with them, because one of my ways of managing my own dysphoria when I was intimate with someone was to kind of offload that onto someone who had a vulva and to kind of project my own thoughts of self onto them. And so I had a lot of conversations with some of my partners at the beginning about how to navigate that, and how to make sure that we were respectful of each other's boundaries and needs while also making sure that we felt good. So, like I said, lots of conversations, lots of talking, probably more than you're used to, but let's be honest, we could all use more conversations around our intimate relationships. Next question. What might cause a transgender individual to not fully transition, meaning surgeries and hormones and the like? Let me start by saying that transition looks very different for everybody. For some people, transition looks like just changing their outfits, maybe not even that, maybe just changing their name and making sure that the exterior social impacts on their life respect who they are. Some people might spend tons of time and energy getting surgeries, go through a hormonal replacement regimen, and I mean, I've even seen people completely obliterate their former lives. I think one of the things to keep in mind with transitions is that they really are personal. Everyone chooses their own path, just like anything else in life. Just like there's no one way to be a cisgender man or woman, there's no one way to be trans. And for a lot of folks who might not be binary, transitioning all the way, so to speak, could be really harmful. It could cause them more dysphoria. So if I can't speak too much to this because my experience is one of a fairly binary trans person. I wouldn't say I am the most femme of femmes. In fact, I'm pretty tomboyish in a lot of respects. But personally, I'm more concerned with getting rid of my dysphoria in the least amount of work. I'm really, really lazy. And it takes a lot of energy to go through surgeries and to go through all sorts of doctor appointments and to get hair removal and all of that nonsense. It's expensive, takes time, takes energy. Let's talk a little bit about my transition. This is something that you don't want to ask most trans people about directly because it is a really personal and often medical thing. You wouldn't ask someone on the street whether they've had surgery related to cancer unless you really knew that person and they had already started to share about that journey with you. And the same thing is true for trans people. Let's talk about my own transition. About 5 years ago, I started hormone replacement therapy. Now, what that does generally is it changes obviously the hormone balance in your body, and one of the first things that starts to show is fat redistribution. So your body stores fat in different places depending on whether you have a whole bunch of estrogen in your system, a whole bunch of testosterone, or a mix somewhere in between. So after 5 years of transitioning, this summer I've been really bad about keeping up with my hormones. Why? Because I've been broke and because I started to have a reaction to the hormone that I was taking. That reaction was entirely just because of the way I was taking it. It was through a transdermal patch, very similar to a nicotine patch or a birth control patch. And my skin is really sensitive to any kind of adhesives. I can't have Tegaderm tape or like the 3M plastic tapes, medical tapes. Anytime I go into the hospital, they gotta use paper tape. Otherwise I swell up like a balloon. When I first went on hormones 5 years ago, I told the doctor, hey, if you put me on this transdermal patch, eventually I'm gonna have to get off of it. And so right now I'm waiting for a follow-up appointment with my doctor to get me off of that patch and onto a different form of hormone replacement. So that'll probably be estrogen through sublingual tablets. You just stick them under your tongue and they absorb and go straight into the bloodstream, and it's great. They're also a lot cheaper than the transdermal patch and should be covered a little bit better by my drug coverage. Let's talk about surgeries. So I actually just got a surgery date, which is kind of huge. I've been waiting a really freaking long time for that. And one of the reasons I've had to wait is because I have ulcerative colitis. There's been a lot more doctor's appointments that have kind of come along with it, and I've been delayed through that, basically all paperwork stuff. And of course the communication on both the side of the government and on the side of the clinic where I'm going to be attending is terrible. It's really bad. You would think with the amount of surgeries that they do, they would be better at communicating across province. They're not. They're really crappy. So that said, what am I getting? Because there are a lot of surgeries that trans people can get. The three main sets of surgeries that trans feminine people can get are facial feminization surgery, where they cut back the brow, they cut back the jawline, they usually change the shape of the nose, sometimes the cheekbones, basically to soften up a lot of the features. Facial feminization surgery is considered cosmetic by most jurisdictions and is not covered here in Alberta, and I don't think anywhere in Canada, but correct me if I'm wrong on that. The next general type of surgery is breast augmentation, so getting boobs. Luckily for myself, estrogen did a great job in redistributing and stimulating breast growth. I don't feel too dysphoric about my boobs. In fact, I really love them. They started growing almost immediately when I was on hormones, and they got to a size that feels like a real person size for me. Like, I'm pretty comfortable with them. But like a lot of things to do with biology, the results of breast growth and of any other kind of puberty stuff is really dependent on genetics and what age you go into hormones. The third type of surgery is bottom surgery. Now, this is, for most trans women, what you would call a vaginoplasty. It's where, I mean, we all know what that kind of looks like. There are a lot of resources online. You can just type in vaginoplasty on Google and it'll give you tons of resources. There are a couple of different ways of doing it, but really what it comes down to is helping someone to have genitals that don't make them feel really uncomfortable every time they get naked or have sex or what have you. So on that note, when it comes to surgeries, they're really scary in a lot of ways, and a lot of people have spent years getting used to their body and managing the dysphoria that comes with the body that they have developed through their first puberty. Getting surgery to lots of trans people seems either superfluous, or maybe they like that part of their body. Maybe they like some parts of what they've been given and they're really okay with that. And personally, I think that's awesome. If you don't have dysphoria from a certain part of your body, then why change it, right? The whole thing about transitioning is to make sure that if you're experiencing dysphoria, that you don't have to, and that you can feel the most comfortable as the person that you are meant to be instead of pretending to be what society thinks that you should be. Next question. Why you make all us born women look ugly? I'm so jealous of trans women. Well, we're just awesome. No, just kidding. I think, honestly, everyone has problems with their own body and their own appearance. And if you don't, good on you. That takes a lot of work in a society that teaches us to hate our bodies. First off, just a thought on word choice there. Born women, a lot of trans women view ourselves as being born female. I mean, just because someone said that we were born male didn't actually necessarily make that true, right? So something to keep in mind. When you're talking about someone as they're born, we're all born babies and little fat sacks of flesh. And yeah, babies are adorable and ugly and all that fun stuff. But to think of someone as being born male or female, the better way to talk about it from an up-to-date language perspective is to talk about how someone's assigned at birth. Not to rag on the person who asked that question at all. That's a really common way of describing people, and I think really it's the only reason I point it out is to make sure that folks know kind of the reasons behind certain language choices. So that said, honestly, I think beauty ideals are ridiculous across the board. I have a lot of problems with how I look, but I also recognize that those problems are entirely internal, entirely caused by my own ideas of what beauty should look like, and that I've just done a lot of work around getting comfortable with that. So I think everyone, cis or trans, should try to do some work to kind of deconstruct societal ideas about what you're supposed to look like, and then from there you can kind of move on to, well, how do I want to look, right? What are some ways to support better and safer workplaces for trans people? How can unions help? Oh, great question. I'm a huge socialist. I love unions. But I think what I have to say to this question really kind of goes both for unionized workplaces and non-unionized workplaces. It's really comes down to education. Making sure that every level of management knows what trans people are about and how to deal with us. One of the things that comes up time and time again for me is when I'm dealing with people who work in different organizations, they want to be accommodating or they want to be positive towards trans people, but they don't have the language, they don't have the skills, they don't have the knowledge. So really for most workplaces and most employers, I think it comes down to getting in people who do know this stuff, and hiring trans people to talk about trans stuff is also a really good thing. I've had lots of allies who are really, really smart and know lots about various things, but when they start to talk about trans stuff, the language is 10 years old, and we live in a society where we're just now starting to catch up on the language that should have been with us all along, but wasn't because trans people were socially repressed. So because we're here now and we're not hiding as much anymore, the best thing to do is get trans people in, experts, pay them to talk about this stuff. It's something I've done personally before, and I will continue to offer to do for individuals who need it or employers who need it. There's this wonderful individual here in Edmonton named Kyle Farrell, and they are a non-binary individual, and they do a lot of work in the area of personal fitness and training. And they've started this group called QueerFlex. Now, QueerFlex is exactly what it sounds like. It's all about getting queer folks into a safe fitness and workout regimen if that's what they want, and making that accessible for queer folks. One of the things that Kyle does as part of QueerFlex is that they actually go out to different gyms and offer this education, because it's really important. I mean, when you have people being pushed out of bathrooms and being accused of spying in the wrong bathroom, change rooms, whatever, you have a lot of queer and trans people who don't feel comfortable going to a gym or any kind of public area where they have to use shared washrooms, like the pool, right? The pool is a big one for me personally. So anyways, all that to say, organizations need to get this education. Organizations need to get this education to their employees. And when stuff comes up, don't be afraid to, first off, to learn more, to take any kind of problem that comes up as a learning opportunity, but then further to that, to address things in a way that's not shameful, but very education focused. That's at least my thoughts on it. Now, as for unions specifically, I would love to see some of the unions, some of the bigger unions, take a stand in regards to some of this stuff. We see a lot of poster campaigns, billboard campaigns by some of the big unions about other social issues, other things that are changing, whether it be through legislation or just social changes. And I think speaking out in regards to some of these things would be a huge, huge help. When you have a large organization making some form of social statement, generally it tends to just kind of cement things a little bit more. I think that's it for now. I have a bunch of questions on the area of LGBTQIA2S plus stuff, and I might do a video on that soon. I might just integrate that into a longer and more formal scripted video series. We'll see how that goes. But otherwise, thanks for watching, and if this gave you burning questions, or if it didn't touch on something that you really think that I should cover, please check out the link in the description. It's a survey where you can fill it out anonymously and ask me anything you want. I don't track any kind of the information off of that, so feel free, phrase it however you want. And if you're not sure of the language, that's totally okay. I'll help in the answer. We'll make sure that I can kind of teach a little bit of the language as we go. That's it for now. We'll see you next time on Big Sky Life. Thanks.